So our speaker tonight is George Ciccariello-Maher. The title of his presentation is A People's History of the Bolivarian Revolution, Building a Revolution from Below. And George is a radical political theorist. He's a political activist in the United States. He's completing a Ph.D. in political theory at the University of California in Berkeley. And he's taught radical theory and politics at UC Berkeley, San Quentin State Prison, and the Venezuela School of Planning. He lives in Oakland now, where he's been recently involved in the campaign against police brutality. George is one of the people who's been interpreting the Venezuelan Revolution for those of us who are outside Venezuela. He's had many articles in journals like Counterpunch and Monthly Review and Venezuela Analysis. He's been quoted in the New York Times and on Al Jazeera and other major media. George has two main scholarly projects that he's working on. The first is his dissertation, which is on the topic of violence and revolutionary identity, looking at the ideas of French syndicalist Georges Sorel and black revolutionary Frantz Fanon. And he tells me his talk today is a bit of an introduction to the book that he's writing on the subject, which is titled We Created Him, which will be published by Duke University Press. And he's also a translator. He's translated books by Enrique Dussel and Emmanuel Wallerstein. So please help me welcome George to Vancouver.
And this is an introduction, and what I'm attempting to do here is a sort of framing for a book project that I'm engaged in, which is a history of the revolutionary organizations in Venezuela since 1958. And the goal of that project is essentially to help us begin to understand what's going on in Venezuela in a way that doesn't focus on Chavez and which doesn't focus on the state in a direct way, but rather focuses and discusses Chavez and the state through the lens of what's been going on for 40 or 50 years in Venezuela. So in that vein, I'd like to say, and I'd like to begin today by making something absolutely clear. The Bolivarian Revolution currently underway in Venezuela is not about Hugo Chavez. He's not the center, he's not the driving motor force, he's not the individual revolutionary genius on whom the process as a whole relies, or in whom it finds its quasi-divine inspiration. To say this may seem almost a heresy to those of us bottle-fed by the North American press, but it's an assertion that has an undeniable, if complicated, truth. To paraphrase the great C.L.R. James, Chavez, like Toussaint Louverture, did not make the revolution. It was the revolution that made Chavez. But in a way, the simple displacement of Chavez's centrality tells us little in and of itself, as James rightly warns. Even that is not the whole truth. It does not tell us specifically who constitutes the revolutionary subject of the Bolivarian process once we deny Chavez that coveted throne. Is it the working class, the peasantry, the informalized urban lumpen proletariat? More importantly, however, it tells us little about the complexities of the relationship that exists between this as yet unidentified revolutionary subject, the transformative process as a whole, and Chavez himself, and more generally speaking, the state apparatus. Luckily, our title tonight gives us a foothold in the matter, suggesting as it does a revolutionary subject worthy of exploration, the people. But once again, the suggestion only raises more questions. Specifically, if this is to be a people's history, two questions in particular stand out. What people and whose history? Rather than presenting a totalizing concept, then, in the words of philosopher Enrique Dussel, the Pueblo establishes an internal frontier or fracture within the political community and stands in opposition to the elites, to the oligarchs, and to the ruling class of a political order. The people is not a unity, but a moment of combat in which those oppressed within the prevailing political order and those excluded from it intervene to transform the system. It's no surprise then that the concept of the people, or the Pueblo, is both central to Venezuelan history and a cause of severe anxiety for elites. This double meaning is reflected throughout the term's history, a potent symbol of which is the Venezuelan national anthem, Gloria al Bravo Pueblo, which literally translates as glory to the brave people. The radicalism of this anthem is difficult to conceal, containing such phrases as let us shout zealousy, death to oppression, and down with chains, and condemnations of vile selfishness. It is such phrases that have made this anthem to the Venezuelan nation, and the concept of the people itself, consistently available for more radical projects. But our story doesn't begin as far back as 1810, the year in which Gloria Bravo Pueblo was penned. If what interests us is a people's history of the process currently underway, we must inevitably seek a more concentrated focus on recent history, grasping the foundational moments that provide the parameters for today's struggles. In my broader project, I begin this history in 1958, the year of the overthrow of Venezuela's last unelected dictator, and the year that nominally marks the establishment of Venezuelan democracy. If it seems strange to begin a history of popular struggle with the establishment of a representative democratic system, this is because it's a conscious inversion of traditional fables in which formal democracy is seen as the result, the ultimate outcome of those struggles and their unquestioned telos. In Venezuela, on the other hand, the establishment of formal democracy marked instead the beginning of another struggle. And it is this struggle that continues today, in large part. We'll begin to get a sense of where this is headed if we briefly quote the unquestioned founding father of Venezuelan democracy, Rómulo Betancourt, for whom the people was a concept, quote, which professional demagogues use in seeking to upset the social order. The people in the abstract does not exist, according to Betancourt. This is speaking in 1962. Betancourt, speaking against the popular rebellions that greeted the early years of his presidency, sensed the radical danger that the concept of the people engendered. He knew it threatened power in general and his power specifically. And so rather than embracing this disruptive and dangerous idea of the people, Betancourt consciously sought to create a so-called democracy which would be protected and insulated from the people, one which recognized the will of the people only through their participation in the two major political parties. This begins to sound familiar. And so we find at the very heart of Venezuela's so-called democracy a conspiracy against the Pueblo, against the people, as a radical moment of rebellious energy. What North American academics, and especially political scientists, call Venezuelan Exceptionalism, a code word for the idea that the country represented an island of stability in the rough seas of dictatorship and crisis, was in fact a carefully crafted system which sought to protect political elites from the people, a carefully crafted anti-democracy. To engage in people's history means to track the development of this exclusionary democratic system during the 4 decades from 1958 to 1998. But it also means to do so in a very particular way. This is the return to our second question: whose history? The answer now seems clear: the history of the people, a redundancy given our title. But having laid out the general parameters of the conflict between a system which actively seeks to exclude the people and the people as revolutionary subject, how does one write this history? Certainly the task is not an easy one, as most existing information and historical accounts are top-down, issued from the commanding heights of state power. Even when these histories are critical of Venezuela's so-called democracy, their optic is often the same, and they remain mesmerized by the state. It is this tendency which, extended into the present, accounts for much of the exaggerated emphasis on Chavez himself. Our method needs to be exactly the opposite. We must track the exclusion of the people from Venezuelan political and economic life, not from above, not from the perspective of those structures which exclude the people, but instead from below, from the perspective of popular organizations and those momentary eruptions of popular rebellion which have shaken the repressive Venezuelan system, ultimately leading to its collapse. This history begins with the guerrilla struggle, which began almost immediately after Betancourt came to power in 1959. Justified popular euphoria at the overthrow of dictator Marcos Pérez Jiménez was short-lived, and those taking to the streets to push their demands for a more radically egalitarian and just social order were met with the searing bullets of the new democracy. When the unemployed demanded jobs, when peasants demanded their land, they were gunned down. When students demanded a democratic university, the university was occupied by tanks. And when leftist parties in Congress justified such popular demands, they were outlawed, their newspapers closed, their representatives stripped of congressional immunity and arrested. All told, the first 2 years of Venezuelan democracy were nothing of the sort, spent largely under the shadow of a state of exception, with constitutional guarantees suspended. It was this overt repression of political organizing that forced young radicals into the countryside, into the hills, and into the armed struggle. When Fabricio Ojeda, a journalist and the former head of the democratic junta that brought down the dictator, resigned his post in Congress to join the armed struggle, later to be tortured and killed by security forces, he closed this speech in Congress dramatically with explicit reference to the national anthem: "Down with chains, death to oppression." But the guerrilla struggle would not meet with huge success in Venezuela. Young Venezuelans enthralled by the recent Cuban example wrongly believed that their small, mobile units of combatants and daring tactics would be able to spark a revolutionary upheaval. And here the French journalist Régis Debray's exportation of a Cuban model of Fouquismo would have devastating effects. Debray's guerrilla model had placed mobility above territory, with a corollary emphasis on military tactics rather than the construction of a political base in local communities. By the time the Venezuelan Armed Forces of National Liberation, or FALN, realized the need for a different strategy, one more akin to the Chinese or Vietnamese models, it was arguably too late. The major parties of the left had withdrawn their support for the armed struggle, leaving the combatants in the hills without political representation or resources. And now we're talking about sort of mid-1960s, 1966. But most decided to fight on regardless, largely under the leadership of a diminutive Douglas Bravo of the Chirinos Front, named for an 18th century leader of slave insurrections. When I spoke with Bravo, he insisted that Debray's thesis on the Fouquista approach to guerrilla warfare constituted a dogmatic deviation in the French author's privileging of the military over the political and the rural over the urban, which in Bravo's words, quote, divorces vanguard action from the bulk of the popular masses. The later stages of the guerrilla struggle would seek to overcome these errors. As Bravo puts it, quote, what was fundamental was to leave immediatism aside, to carry out profound mass work, and to avoid unnecessary combat. And while this orientation was put into practice in western Venezuela under Bravo's Party of the Venezuelan Revolution, or PRV, and in the east under Carlos Betancourt's Red Flag, or Bandera Roja party, these efforts had begun to dissipate and fragment in the face of demographic obsolescence and the socialization of state violence. But while many are tempted to dismiss the guerrilla struggle as an abject failure, and the losses were indeed severe, it nevertheless laid the strategic, ideological, and cultural basis for later radicalism. This socialization of violence reached its perverse apex in the 1989 Caracasso riots and their bloody aftermath. The Caracasso is of unparalleled importance for recent Venezuelan history. It was the moment at which Venezuelan history broke in half, when the showcase window of this, what we've seen to be a repressive and exclusionary democracy, was irreparably shattered. The rigid structures of exclusion were unable to bend and could only violently break. The spark was provided by a neoliberal reform package that went into effect in early 1989 at the dictates of the World Bank. Before the end of the Cold War, before the Zapatistas, before Seattle, there was the Caracasso, the first shot across the bow of neoliberalism, and the first battle in a global war. When Perez's reforms came into effect, dedicated in part to the liberalization of domestic gasoline prices, the poor residents of the barrios awoke to find the cost of transportation had doubled overnight. Spontaneous rebellion spread immediately across Caracas and across the country as a whole, only quelled a week later by the iron heel of Venezuelan democracy, after nearly a week of rebellion at a cost of up to 3,000 lives. The Caracasso represented the immediate backdrop of Chávez's emergence, and the single event that transformed him into a historical actor. As part of a young generation of military officers, Chávez and others had formed a secret Bolivarian conspiracy some years earlier, only to find themselves deployed during the Caracasso to order young recruits to slaughter their own people. In fact, Chávez's initial coup in 1992 was originally scheduled to coincide symbolically with the third anniversary of the Caracasso rebellion. Chávez was imbued with this legacy of the people as a revolutionary actor, a legacy that he and others would root in Bolívar, but also in more overtly radical figures like Zamora, a peasant leader who preached open hatred of the oligarchy. To this, we can add the direct contacts that Chávez and other conspirators had with Douglas Bravo, this former guerrilla leader, and his PRV organization, as well as more contemporary movements like the urban militias, like the Afro-Venezuelan movement, like the indigenous movements, all of whom took direct part in the failed 1992 coup against the old order. When Chávez pronounced his famous por ahora, admitting defeat but only for now, this was not a promise or a threat that he could or would fulfill as an individual. It was an expression of this revolutionary tradition which runs so deep in Venezuela, but which can escape full recognition if not understood in its proper context. The Venezuelan guerrilla struggle, then, as we've been seeing, even its ostensible failure, laid the foundations for a number of other revolutionary emergences and a culture of resistance whose official representative within the state structure would eventually come to be Chavez. But needless to say, this multitude of forces that has blossomed throughout the course of the past 5 decades is not reducible to the president. In fact, open conflict with the head of state is frequent. And as just one example, we could mention the fact that Douglas Bravo has actively opposed Chavez since breaking with him in the mid-1990s. But this is really, the example of Douglas Bravo is perhaps misleading, because he's literally one of 1 or 2 former guerrilla leaders out of dozens that oppose Chavez, while the vast majority support him critically. But while this particular opposition is more often than not rhetorical, clashes between the state and armed militias often assume a more serious character, as occurred only a couple of months back when Chavez actually called for the arrest of La Piedrita leader Valentin Santana. Although it is unlikely that Santana will ever be arrested, and it's unclear if the police or the state are even capable of doing so, the conflict between the revolutionary base and the state leadership are sufficiently tense to represent a real threat to the Bolivarian process. But what is fundamental is to recognize that the most revolutionary segments of Venezuelan society actively support Chavez. Santana even told me that and this is the same Santana that Chavez called for his arrest, Santana even told me that he considers Chavez the maximum leader of the process and the only thing preventing a civil war in Venezuela. This sentiment is echoed by nearly every revolutionary group in Venezuela, leaving individuals like Douglas Bravo effectively excluded from any importance. Moreover, while Afro-Venezuelan, indigenous, and women's organizations, for example, have rarely been fully content with the positions taken by Chavez and by the slow progress of change, all have nevertheless benefited significantly from institutional transformations, and nearly all support the revolutionary process as a strategic means to their desired ends. It is this complex position, one which transcends a merely academic position of so-called critical support, that we must grasp and assume, and which I've sought to capture, at least in part through the resuscitation and other work of the concept of dual power, in which popular organizations represent a reservoir of revolutionary energy at the base, which intervenes against the state structure in its traditional bureaucratic and militarist form. But such a view does not mean that Chavez as an individual is purely a representative of the repressive state apparatus in its bureaucratic and military elements. His position is far more complex and nuanced than that. In the struggle to push the contemporary revolutionary process forward, Chavez has for the most part been an ally, certainly not always. While engaged in the complex doublespeak of the state, he has more often than not pushed a radical agenda, which facilitates the transformations of that same state, a fact most visible in the recent development of communal councils, which is something that's worth discussing more. So we must move beyond the naive dichotomy of pro-Chavez and anti-Chavez to say, alongside the majority of the revolutionary segments of Venezuelan society, that we support Chavez insofar as he supports the revolution. Or to paraphrase this most complex of all contemporary figures in Venezuela, Chavez, we are with you, pero por ahora, only for now. Thank you, that's all I've got to say, and I'd love to have all the questions that you can possibly throw at me.